All right, thank you very much for that introduction. You know, it's really fantastic to be here. I actually first came to Tucson for the first time in 2002 as a graduate student, studying philosophy and psychology, working in a psychology lab, and we had heard about this mythical consciousness conference where everyone interested in consciousness came together, and I figured I had to be a part of that. So we came here as a group. I presented as a poster for my very first presentation, as a matter of fact, and the energy was dynamic, and not only that, but the culture of consciousness that these kind of gatherings bring about are really phenomenal. And it was there I realized that you could actually do this seriously and think about consciousness all the time. And so I want to thank the conference organizers for putting this together and for contributing to the culture of consciousness. Okay, so I'm here to talk about higher order theories of phenomenal consciousness. And so just a quick word about the word phenomenal consciousness here. Some people mistrust this word. Some people find it vacuous and meaningless, and other people don't. And I'm one of the ones that don't. So I think for better or worse, it's become part of our language. And the one thing I want to guard against is the idea that when you use a term like this, you are smuggling in something theoretical without having to argue for it. And so I do want to be very careful to point out that the way that I use the term is supposed to be theory neutral. And I'm citing a couple of people on the slide, David Chalmers notably, and also Josh Weisberg, two very different philosophers of consciousness, interested in different kinds of approaches to consciousness. But nonetheless, they endorse this kind of neutral idea that phenomenal consciousness just picks out conscious experience and its properties. And that leaves open the kinds of questions that I want to talk about, whether it belongs at the lower order level, at the higher level, whether cognition has it, whether it's only something that sensory states have or what. So I want to be completely as neutral as possible in that respect. So when we're trying to explain what phenomenal consciousness is, a theory is higher order in the way that I use those terms when it appeals to a kind of inner awareness. So we have awareness of things in the environment. We have also an awareness of things that are going on inside the mind. And a theory of consciousness is higher order when it claims that there's a special role for this kind of inner awareness. This is canonically summed up in what has been known as the Transitivity Principle, which goes back to the work of David Rosenthal. And it states that a mental state is conscious when the subject is appropriately conscious of that state. And we use the word conscious and aware here to be synonyms. Now, higher order theories then would be distinguished by how they try to explain what this notion of inner awareness is. And so the various kinds of theories that you find in the literature will try to give a differing account of what this inner awareness is. Traditionally, going back to maybe John Locke, and other people would argue maybe even Descartes and Kant and possibly Aristotle, so folk psychology seems to recognize that there are two basic ways that we become aware of things. On the one hand, we sense or perceive things in the environment, and on the other hand, we think about things. And so what you have found up till this point is theories sort of circling around these two areas. So we have higher order perception theories and we have higher order thought theories, and a large part of what's been going on currently is trying to figure out which of these two people think is more likely to be a good account of inner awareness. And these two kinds of things, perception and thinking, have generally thought to be being able to be grouped under one general category, namely the category of representation. And this can be canonically expressed, the reasons for this, I mean, can be canonically expressed by the argument that was given by Bill Lycan way back in 2001. So this is a quote from his analysis paper called A Simple Argument for Higher Order Representational Theories of Consciousness. Has three premises. The first premise is just a kind of way of phrasing the transitivity principle. It says that a conscious state is a state whose subject is aware of being in it. The second premise says that the of in aware of is that of intentionality. The third premise is that intentionality is representation, and from that we can derive that awareness of a mental state is a representation of that state, and also that a conscious state is therefore a state that is represented by one of the subject's mental states. So I think that this argument is in the background of a lot of theorizing about higher order theories. And what's interesting to me and what I want to focus on in my talk today is the way in which people who consider themselves in some sense to be a member of the higher order theory camp have tried to challenge each one of these premises. So I want to go through briefly and talk about how these kind of alternative theories have come about. And I want to start by what I think is kind of an interesting challenge because it originates from the author of the argument. So there's Bill Lycan and his student Wesley Surrett, and they recently have a paper, it's called Attention and Internal Monitoring, a Farewell to Higher Order Perception, which came out in Analysis in 2014. And there they think that there's something problematic going on in this argument that I just sketched, and they point to the second premise. So they say the problematic move occurs in the second premise. The of in the phrase aware of is not the of intentionality. way. Instead, it is some other non-cognitive, non-representational relation. And you might think that's a bit surprising at first, because we start off thinking, well, there are two basic ways that we recognize we become aware of things. On the one hand, perception, on the other hand, thought. And if we find some reason to doubt that there's any kind of room for higher order perception, then maybe we should be thinking about higher order thought theories a bit more. But instead, they deny that and are searching for some kind of non-cognitive, non-representational notion. And the reason for this is that in the empirical search for a kind of inner sense, they think that we've discovered that there is no good evidence for any kind of inner sense or higher order perception. And so they technically say that the higher order perception theory has been falsified. And instead, what we find is evidence that regular attention is the mechanism by which we become aware of our mental states. And furthermore, they think that the empirical literature has shown us that attention in this ordinary sense is not representational or not cognitive in that sense. And so they go on to say, this is from the same paper, that the tenability of this view, that ordinary attention is the mechanism that gives enables subjects to become aware of their mental states, is going to be dependent on us giving a theory or an account of what this awareness relation amounts to. So the mechanism is not enough. We need some kind of notion of what this awareness relation is, and they trot out two possible candidates. On the one hand, some kind of acquaintance, and on the other hand, they cite Bloch's 2007 paper suggesting some kind of awareness access relation. And so I want to look at both of these two proposals in turn. It may be somewhat surprising to see Ned Bloch's name there as a candidate for thinking about higher order theories, because he's often associated with the first order theory. But what has become increasingly clear in the recent discussion about this is that Ned does endorse something like the transitivity principle, but what he wants to deny is that the way we explain that is by some kind of higher order cognitive state. So here's a quote from his exchange with Josh Weisberg and David Rosenthal, also on Analysis, which has been a really good place for debates about consciousness recently. So he says, Weisberg ascribes to me the view that pains matter, even if the subject is in no way aware of them. I, Bloch, strongly deny this view, noting that to say one is necessarily aware of one's phenomenally conscious state should not be taken to imply that every phenomenally conscious state is one the subject notices or attends to or perceives or thinks about. I deny the Rosenthal-Weisberg theory of awareness, not awareness itself. So it does seem to me as though there is a recognition in Ned's work that some kind of inner awareness is important, but we want an account of that. And so he has at various times proposed two kinds of notions of inner awareness that he would be happy with. The first is a kind of deflationary notion inspired by the work of Ernie Sosa. So Sosa famously remarked that, yes, it's true that we smile our own smiles, but the smiling of your own smile is not something extra in addition to you having a smile. It's just that you smile, and because of the way that we talk and the language that we use, we have to say, yes, it's also true that you're smiling your own smile. So that's a deflationary notion. And in a similar vein, Bloch has suggested, well, perhaps we can make sense of inner awareness along these lines. So when you have a phenomenally conscious experience of red, there's something that it's like for you. And yes, we also have to say that you're aware of that awareness, but maybe it's not anything extra in addition, over and above the first order state. I myself have always been very suspicious of this move. It doesn't seem to me to be able to do justice to the difference between conscious states and unconscious states, so that it seems that any kind of representation in the brain is going to be deflationarily self-aware in this kind of way, and it doesn't really seem to me to be an alternative. And even if you do like this kind of view, it certainly is not going to be the kind of thing I think that those who were attracted to the higher order perception view, like Lycan was, are going to account for. Now, to endorse, I'm sorry. Now, the self-reflexive view has been something that Bloch has also suggested. So he says, look, if you can force me out of my deflationary standpoint, then what I will do is fall back on some kind of self-representational view, so that the inner awareness that's important here will be somehow a part of the state itself. But it's important to note that the kind of inner awareness, which if it is a part of the state itself, would have to be something that's not intentional, something that's not representational, something that doesn't involve intention or noticing or any of those kinds of things that were on the list. And it doesn't really seem clear to me that we have a viable alternative here. Rather, what it looks to me is that we have the promissory note or request for someone to develop an alternative account. And so really what I think is going on here is that the list of alternatives boil down to just one, and that's acquaintance. And in fact, we have seen several kinds of theorists come out and say, yes, we want a higher order acquaintance type of theory. And so here's David Chalmers in his recent exchange, which also came out in Analysis, a symposium on his book, The Contents of Consciousness. And so he says, in response to Benj Hailey, which this particular quote came from, he says, I think the most plausible line here is that phenomenal awareness is an acquaintance involving relation by its very nature. In virtue of the nature of awareness, to be aware of X entails being acquainted with one's awareness of X. So this seems to me to be something like the notion that Ned Block was looking for. You have an awareness of red and also an acquaintance with that awareness. And this is the footnote to that passage, quite kind of a long footnote. But here Dave is saying, yes, he recognizes that this is a relative of higher order representational theories, but specifically the kind of self-representational views that we find inspired by Brentano and have been explored by Kriegel and Willeford recently. And of course, the big difference here is that this is a non-standard kind of representation. So I think that what these views have in common is that they're trying to challenge the second premise of the simple argument. Yes, we think that there's kind of an awareness here, but no, we don't think that this awareness involves intentionality. It's also important to note, I think, that Dave's view is non-physical, which is well known, and people have tried to develop acquaintance theories from a physicalistic perspective. I think that's going to be rather difficult. So I want to come back and say something about this, but before I do, I want to sort of look at the third premise. So the third premise of that argument was the claim that intentionality is representation. And many people have sort of started to think, well, possibly we might challenge that premise. And most notably, I think recently, Sam Coleman has developed a kind of quotational higher order view. So his view is that you have a higher order state. It tells you roughly that the following state is present, has a mechanism for quotation. And then the actual state that's present gets somehow embedded in that very higher order state. And this is explicitly endorsed as a way of generating intentionality that is not representational. So here's a quote from his paper. He says, quotational higher order thoughts make one aware of sensory states, and the of is indeed the of intentionality, but it is false that this of demands to be understood representationally. Something can be an intentional content by being contained, literally a content. The content of a completed quotational hot includes its embedded sensory state. So there are other versions of quotational higher order theory out there. There's a recent one that's defended by Vincent Picciuto, and I don't think that, I'm aware that he would not endorse the view that this is a non-conceptual type of representation, but all of these views, whether the details here in the terminology are a bit tricky, but the thing that they all have in common is that they want to deny that it's standard kind of intentional conceptual representation that's involved, and they're looking for another notion of what this kind of inner awareness could be. Now, I think that these views all kind of share a similar kind of worry here. So I think that worry can be brought out by asking this kind of question here. And the question is, yes, when we have a phenomenally conscious experience of red, there's something that it's like for me. There's a reddish wave towards me. I'm aware of a mental quality and thereby by hypothesis also aware of my awareness of that mental quality. But the question really for me is what happens when that mental quality is not in your consciousness, when it's out there, unattended, unaware in any sense. And the question I want to ask is, what is that property like? So is the blueness of the blue still the way that it is when you're phenomenally conscious of it, or is it some other way? So on the left here, I think this is the view that some people have, that these properties just are the way that they are, and then the only thing that happens is that you become aware of them. Whereas on the right-hand side over here, we have the view that unconscious qualities, the blueness of the blue is not there until the appropriate inner awareness is directed in that way. So I think these are roughly the only two options that you can take, and either way, I think that the ultimate problem here is that you've ended up giving up on an important explanatory goal of a theory of consciousness. So if you say yes, that the unconscious qualities, the redness of blue, the redness of red is exactly there as it was in my consciousness when I'm not aware of it in any way, then I think that you're going to end up having to say something like pan-qualityism is true, that these things are a fundamental part of the nature of the universe, and that it by itself isn't so bad. But the bad part to me comes by admitting that we cannot give an explanation for that part of how consciousness arises. So yes, on this view, we can explain the difference between a conscious mental quality and an unconscious mental quality, and that difference would amount to an awareness of the one, but we can't explain why the mental quality is the way that it is, or how that quality shows up in our conscious experience, so to speak. So I think we've given up on half of the explanatory project. Now, on the other hand, if you say, well, no, these mental qualities aren't that way when you aren't aware of them, and then you you add the awareness and suddenly there's the blueness of blue and the redness of red. I think that you've also similarly given up on the explanatory project because you're going to end up postulating that there's some kind of brute causal mechanism in the universe that just so happens to magically make it the case that when these two things get together, then there's phenomenal consciousness. So I think that there you've also given up on trying to explain how it is that these mental qualities we're aware of get to be the red that we're familiar with from our conscious experience. Now, I do want to add very quickly that I don't find these knockdown arguments. In fact, I'm very firmly convinced that there's no such thing as a knockdown argument in philosophy. And in fact, I do find plausibility in these views. So sometimes in my more optimistic moods, I think to myself, what are the problems here? I don't know. So the redness of red is there. I'm just not looking at it. What's the big deal? On the other hand, I say, hey, brute causal forces in nature. Explanation's got to stop somewhere. Maybe it stops here. So it's not as though I think that these are reasons to abandon that view, but I do think that these are costs, and that it would be at least worth getting clear on what the other side can do. And then in my darker moments, in my more pessimistic moods, when I'm suffering from a bout of depression, I think, well, wait a minute, why are we giving up on concepts so quickly here? Why are we looking for a non-cognitive, non-representational notion of inner awareness when we already have higher order thoughts available and we shouldn't abandon them too quickly? They have the advantage insofar as at least they start with something recognizably psychological. And there are those of us who think that that's an important starting place for a theory of consciousness. Consciousness seems to me to be something which lives at the psychological level, and it would be nice to be able to explain it in terms of other things which are fairly well understood in terms of psychology. Now, I don't think that that's, again, much of a good reason to reject a view, but I do think it's at least a good reason for exploring the alternatives. And that leads me to the first premise. So the first premise is that of the simple argument from Lycan. The first premise was that a conscious state is a state whose subject is aware of being in it. And many people have thought that this is sort of definitive of higher order theories, and that a theory that denies this, at least in the way that it's expressed there, is going to be something that's not a higher order theory. But even this first premise has been challenged by higher order theorists. So there's one there challenging, in the middle of challenging it, and you may recognize that person as me in my non-bearded form. You may wonder, how can something as basic to the higher order theory as what is the transitivity principle be challenged? And I want to explain that, but by doing that, I want to back up first and give an analogy. So I think that if you think about perception and theories of perception in the philosophical literature, what we find there are basically two competing views. On the one hand, there are those people who think that the world has the properties that it has independently of our perception. The sounds and so forth are out there. And then what happens when we perceive them is we simply enter into an awareness relation with those things. This view is sometimes called direct realism, although if you don't like it, you could call it naive realism. On the other hand, there are the representationalists, and here representation is supposed to be explicitly contrasted with relational. So a representational theory of perception says we don't need to have the tree with the property of green out there. All you need to do is have the right kind of representation representing that there is a tree out there. And so these kinds of views I think are well known from the philosophy of perception. But what's interesting is that within the higher order theories landscape itself, we have seen a similar kind of debate being developed. So on the one hand, we have what I will be calling the traditional higher order thought theories. And the traditional higher order thought theories all have a kind of explanatory project in mind. What they note is that on the one hand, these states occur consciously, and sometimes they also occur unconsciously. So they take the explanatory project of higher order theories to be starting with a state which is unconscious, say a representation of something green in the environment. And then the question is, how does that very state turn into a conscious state? And then we postulate a mechanism that's supposed to help us understand that. And in this case, the mechanism will be some kind of higher order thought. And so the higher order thought is supposed to somehow take that state that is there and turn it into a conscious state. And then the question that has been debated extensively, and which you may have heard some of the debates going on recently, is, well, do we have to add anything else? Do we have to strengthen the relationship? Do we have to say more than that the two states are logically independent and add maybe that they're built into a complex, or that there's some kind of global state that they're integrated into? Maybe we have to include the wide intentionality of the first order states. So a lot of the debate has been trying to understand what the correct relation between higher order states and first order states has to be in order to generate a conscious experience. On the other hand, I think that there are some well-known problems for this kind of view, and I'm not really going to talk too much about these problems, but I will just sort of mention them. So on the one hand, there's the problem of the rock, which goes all the way back to Alvin Goldman, and this is the problem of understanding how it is that having a thought can turn something into a conscious state. So it's a claim that it does it for first order states, but it's not to do it for rocks when I think about rocks. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about this problem, but in my opinion, no good answer from the traditional theorists has ever been given. So I'm sure we can discuss that. On the other hand, though, there's the problem of misrepresentation. And this is the problem of what happens when the two levels of content mismatch. So what happens when you have a first order representation of red, you have a higher order representation of yourself as seeing blue. The question is, well, what's going on there? And the traditional higher order theorists have said, well, nothing is going on there. You don't have a conscious experience because you have to have a match between the contents, the first order state, the higher order state, they have to match somehow. And that just seems to me to be totally ad hoc and not supported by anything within the theory, which isn't question begging. So I know that those are very quick, but even if you don't really believe that these objections are fatal, they still give us some reason to search around for another kind of view. And so partially because of this, people have turned to exploring explicitly non-relational higher order thought theories. In my own view, my reading of David Rosenthal has him as a non-relational higher order thought theorist, but that's neither here nor there. Now, of course, you could say, did he change his mind at some point? I don't think that's a very interesting question, but maybe yes, maybe no. The big point that I want to make is that there are two different kinds of theories here. So on the one hand, the kind I was previously discussing, and on the other hand, a different kind of theory which doesn't ask the same kind of question. It doesn't give the same kind of answer. So from a non-relational point of view, the goal of the theory of consciousness is not to tell me how a first order state turns into a conscious state, but it's rather to account for the mental appearances of the subject. So we start with this idea that a consciousness involves the mental appearances, something I think that is widely accepted by many different people. And then we note an important datum, which is that sometimes it appears as though there's a first order state there, even though when we have good reason to believe that there are no first order states there, but the subject doesn't seem to notice, and from their point of view, everything seems to be the same. So this is the starting point for the non-relational version of the theory. We note, well, gee, if you can have the higher order state and the subject's appearances are the same, the first order state doesn't seem to be really contributing to the phenomenology or to the conscious experience of the person, and so why not just say that the higher order state is responsible for the phenomenology. I think that this has all automatic advantages. There's no problem about rocks because we're not thinking about something and turning it into a conscious state. And there's no problem about dividing the labor here because there's no question that on this view, it's explicitly the higher order state which is doing all the work. Now, there are many different versions of this kind of non-relational theory, and there are, the differences between these theories can be brought out by asking the following question. And the question is, well, which state is it which is phenomenally conscious? And I understand that question to be asking, well, which state is it that there is something that it is like for the subject to be in? So the traditional theorists have said, well, it's the first order state. It's the state that you become aware of and somehow gets enveloped or globally integrated or something like that. But it's the first order state which is sort of determining what the phenomenal character of the experience is like. And then you can ask, well, what happens in mixed mass cases, or in the worst possible case, what happens when the first order state is not present at all? And so in response, Rosenthal and Weisberg has suggested, well, maybe it's the non-existent intentional object of the higher order thought which becomes phenomenally conscious. And some people have found that to be very puzzling, that a phenomenally conscious state turns out to be a non-existent state. And I think that there is a way to make sense of that. I don't think it's the most puzzling thing that I've heard at this conference so far, but it is definitely, I think, something that you want to avoid having to say. And so partially because of that, I've suggested that we should think that it's the higher order state itself which is phenomenally conscious. And so I've coined the term the horror theory of phenomenal consciousness, the higher order representation of a representation, as a way to distinguish this kind of distinctive approach to the higher order theory. So this has all been kind of abstract, and I want to just try to picture it a little bit. So according to the horror theory, we start with the physical objects out there. They will have various properties. We could call that object blue, but there will be no blueness as is experienced in consciousness. Rather, instead, there will be just some physical property which will cause in the appropriate perceiver a representation of that kind of object. And you can call that a qualitative character if you want. Some people don't really like calling it that because at this point, according to the theory, there is no phenomenally conscious experience going on. But nonetheless, There are some reasons to think that you should call it that. Either way that you go, though, there is no phenomenal consciousness until you have the appropriate higher order state representing that you are in fact seeing blue, and then at that point it becomes like seeing blue from you. And importantly, the way you experience it is as described by the higher order state. So in this case, it would be like seeing something in the external environment, and that thing would be blue. The first order state, the state which is described by the higher order state, is the target of the higher order representation. And we can say that there's a sense of consciousness in which that state is conscious. We could call it state consciousness, but it's not phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness on this view is a matter of what the higher order state is doing. So if we adopt the kind of language that was introduced by Uriah Kriegel, we could distinguish the subjective character of the experience, which is that which all phenomenally conscious experiences have in common. And on this view, what they all have in common is that you are representing that you are yourself in some various state, and we would distinguish that from the phenomenal character of the experience, which is the way in which all these phenomenally conscious experiences would differ. So on the horror theory of phenomenal consciousness, that would be the specific way you represent yourself as either seeing blue, hearing a sound, feeling pain, or whatever. So the difference between the conscious experiences is given by the content of the higher order thought. And the crucial claim here is that even if the first order state were missing, subjectively, there would be no difference. It would still be like seeing blue from you. You would not be able to tell the difference. Now, of course, there would be some difference in your psychological functioning. So if someone asked you to press a button or do some other kind of task, then you would fail at it because the first order state, which is usually driving the behavior, would be missing. So that's roughly the view of consciousness that I think that is an alternative to the kind of acquaintance views that we were speaking about earlier. And I do want to kind of try to head off a couple of common objections that I hear when I talk about this. So on the one hand, this is not a version of self-representational theory. Many people have suggested that it sounds like a self-representational theory, but it isn't. And the key difference, of course, is that the higher order state doesn't represent the higher order state, which is the basic tenet of self-representational theories. The higher order state represents one's self, so your very self in some way, but it doesn't represent the very higher order state itself. And so yes, if you wanted to use the language developed by Miguel Sebastian, you could say it's a self-involving theory or something like that, but it's not as though the higher order state is self-representational. In response to that, some people have said, well, gee, it sounds like you're denying the transitivity principle because here's some conscious experience, it's phenomenal consciousness. You've already said that phenomenal consciousness is the kind of neutral term that everyone uses, and now you're telling us that it's just this higher order state. So where's the transitivity principle? It seems like you've given up on the traditional view of transitivity. And to that I say, yes, we have given up on the traditional view of transitivity, and the traditional view posits a relation between the first order state and the higher order state. It's somehow explanatory important. And on the current view, there's no relation that's important between the two states. But that doesn't mean that we've given up on the transitivity principle in general. This is a higher order state, higher order theory of consciousness. And so we would interpret the transitivity principle as saying that a phenomenally conscious state consists in my being aware of myself as having first order states. And that's a very strong endorsement of the transitivity principle, but understood in a non-relational way. At the same time, I think that one of the benefits of this kind of view is that it preserves many of the things that first order representationalist theories try to communicate. So here we have some consciousness, you're not aware of it, you're not noticing it, you're not perceiving it, you're not attending to it. And so that's a key element of first order views that's preserved by this kind of higher order theory. And so we could even say, along with many first order theories, that conscious state is one you're conscious with, not one that you're conscious of. And even that turns out to be true on this view because the phenomenal consciousness is one you're conscious with, but what you're conscious with it is of yourself as having a mental life. So there are key differences between first order theories. Okay, so now we've arrived at a place where I think that we have kind of a fork in the road. On the one hand, we have those who want to say, look, it's got to be some kind of non-intentional, non-cognitive, non-representational theory of inner awareness. And on the other hand, the most plausible view of the higher order thought theory, I think, is one that involves just intentional representations and nothing else. So you might wonder, is there any middle ground here where we can try to have the best of both worlds? And so I think that maybe there is, and in some work that I've done with Ha-Kwan Lau, we've explored what we call joint determination views. And joint determination views really try to understand a way of combining bringing the things that we were talking about with respect to acquaintance and the things that we're talking about with respect to intentional representation into a way that combines them. So just as a way of trying to illustrate what the differences are here, this is a joint determination view. Would start off in the same way. You have some physical properties out there, but nothing like the colors that we experience in consciousness. That will cause in a perceiver the appropriate first order state, still no consciousness until there is the appropriate higher order state, at which point you become aware of the first order state, and then there's phenomenal consciousness. So on this view, the big difference is in the content of the higher order state. On the one hand, the higher order acquaintance views try to find a role for the first order state that's more intimate, that's not distanced by a layer of representation. On the other hand, the horror theory tries to say, well, it's all just a kind of intentional representation. So we posit that there's some kind of mix in between. There's a part of the higher order representation which is estimating the reliability of the signal at the first order level. In this case, it would be something like I am vividly perceiving, or I am mildly perceiving, or the thing is just noise, I'm not perceiving at all. And then on the other hand, there's a pointer to where the first order state can be found. Now, I understand mental pointing in kind of analogous terms to hyperlinks in HTML. So I have this here, I'm vividly perceiving the content of representation F. Representation F is not supposed to be thought of as a description in conceptual terms of the first order state, but it's rather just giving you the address of where the first order state lives, maybe somewhere in V4 or something like that. And if you were to sort of click through, you could call up the first order state and sort of introspect it, but at this point there would just be a kind of, this is vivid, in a pointer to a certain location. And so the way in which this is similar to the traditional views is that we have separated the subjective character from the phenomenal character. And if it had been the case that the object had caused the first order representation of red, so if representation F were not a first order representation of green, but instead a representation of red, then the theory postulates that what it would be like for you would be like consciously experiencing red. So the first order state directly matters in a way that it doesn't on the horror theory. Now, of course, the big difference is that on the traditional view, if you were missing the first order state, they posit that there's no phenomenal consciousness at all, whereas on the joint determination views, we postulate that there is nonetheless some kind of conscious experience. So if the higher order states represents that you are vividly experiencing the content of representation F, and if there is no representation F at the first order level, nonetheless, the theory says you're gonna report that you're vividly experiencing something, because that's what the higher order state says, and that's what determines what it's like for you. So you would have the experience as of vividly perceiving something, but then if someone asked you what it was that you were perceiving, you would be at chance with respect to giving the correct answer. So that's a very different kind of view than the traditional views, which postulate that in such a case there is no conscious experience. And we think that actually this kind of view does a very good job of handling all the puzzling empirical cases having to do with the Sperling partial report paradigms and the work that's been done on that in the current times. Okay, so as a way of concluding then, I do want to point out that I think that the joint determination view suffers from the same problems as the higher order acquaintance views, because it just becomes extremely mysterious to me how it is that referring or pointing or somehow indexing or something like that to a first order state lets the content of that state into the phenomenology of the subject. So it just doesn't seem to me to be any good account of how it is that these mental qualities come about. So it seems to me that if you wanted to be a higher order theorist, the horror theory is your best bet. It's the best bet at giving an explanation of how consciousness arises. And so in other work, I've tried to extend this. So in work with Pete Mandic, we've looked at how this applies to cognitive phenomenology, and we think it straightforwardly does. And then a current work I'm doing with Joseph Ledoux, we're trying to expand this to emotional consciousness, and we think that really the horror theory is our best chance to make sense of the phenomenology of emotions, which we find to be very complex. So I think it's very exciting time to be working on higher order theories here. Now, of course, you might wonder whether or not there are any good reasons to accept something like the horror theory as opposed to it being the only good option in town. And I think that there are. I think that there are good arguments that we can give here, but since I'm running out of time, maybe we'll save those for discussion. So thank you very much.